"Mr. Brooks, your blood pressure is dangerously high and you have worrying neurological symptoms. You need to go to the hospital now." The words, spoken with a quiet firmness that was utterly at odds with the speaker's uniform, sliced through the billionaire's tirade like a surgeon's scalpel through flesh. Richard Brooks, the 53-year-old titan of industry and owner of a pharmaceutical empire valued at a staggering $2 billion, froze mid-shout, his cell phone still pressed to his ear. He turned, his eyes accustomed to commanding boardrooms and intimidating rivals, slowly focusing on the 42-year-old black woman standing by his mahogany desk. She held a bottle of cleaning spray in one hand and a microfiber cloth in the other, her presence as unobtrusive as the ficus plant in the corner, yet her voice had just carried the weight of a thunderclap.kesha. Washington stood her ground, her posture straight, her gaze steady. She had watched him for the last 10 minutes as he paced his palatial office on the 30th floor of the Brooks Pharmaceutical Tower. She had seen him stagger, a brief but terrifying loss of coordination. She had noted the subtle tremor in the hand that held his phone, the slight slur to his words as he berated a subordinate in another hemisphere. They were signs she recognized with the chilling certainty of long and painful experience. Signs that everyone else in his orbit, the sycophantic executives on the video conference, the terrified personal assistant just outside his door, had either failed to see or, more likely, chosen to ignore. "Excuse me." A laugh, dry and derisive, rattled in Richard's chest. He lowered his phone, the call momentarily forgotten. "Are you giving me medical advice now? What is your background again?" "Advanced cleaning." The sarcasm was a blunt instrument, designed to crush, to humiliate, to put her back in her place. "Sir, I'm not just—" Kesha began, her voice even, but he cut her off, his face flushing a dangerous, mottled red. "You're nothing but a cleaning lady," he growled, the words dripping with a casual, ingrained contempt. "Go back to your chemicals and let me run my company in peace. And next time, do your job in silence." What Richard Brooks, in his towering arrogance, could not possibly know was that the woman he had just dismissed as a nonentity had been a registered nurse for 15 years, a damn good one. She had run the night shift on a busy neurology ward, made life-or-death decisions with a calm that had inspired confidence in doctors and patients alike. And then, she had lost everything. Her career, her reputation, her license, all of it sacrificed on the altar of a fabricated scandal. A brutal, racially charged witch hunt designed to protect a powerful, well-connected doctor. The experience had forced her into the shadows, into a world of low-wage jobs, where her brilliant medical mind was her own closely guarded secret. But that mind had never stopped working, never stopped observing, never stopped diagnosing. For weeks, she had been watching Richard Brooks. She had noted the almost imperceptible decline, the slowed coordination when he reached for a pen, the occasional slurring of a word, which he would cover with a cough, the brief but increasingly frequent episodes of disorientation, which he dismissed as the stress of running a global empire. The symptoms were a textbook constellation, a terrifyingly clear picture of a serious neurological condition, one that, if left untreated, would undoubtedly be fatal. "I understand perfectly, Mr. Brooks," Kesha replied, her voice imbued with an unsettling calm that seemed to irritate him even more. "I'll keep doing my job." As Richard turned his back, resuming his multi-million-dollar phone call, Kesha did something he would never have expected. She began to document in the small, worn notebook she kept in the pocket of her uniform. She made a note of the date, the time, the specific symptoms she had just witnessed. It was a habit ingrained in her from her nursing days, a discipline that had once been her greatest professional strength and had later been used as a weapon against her. She documented every tremor, every episode of confusion, every moment when his monumental arrogance overrode his most basic instinct for survival. Richard Brooks believed he was the master of his universe, a king surveying his domain from a glass tower. He saw the people below him as pawns on a chessboard, their movements dictated by his will. He had no idea that the most important piece on the board, the one with the power to save his life, was the one he considered utterly invisible. As Kesha quietly polished the surface of his vast empty desk, her trained eyes missed nothing. She knew what was happening inside Richard Brooks's head, and more importantly, she knew exactly what to do about it. For anyone who has ever been underestimated, judged by the color of their skin or the uniform they wear, knows a secret, powerful truth. Sometimes, the greatest victory is simply being right when the entire world has decided you are wrong, and Kesha Washington was about to be proven right, in a way that would bring a billionaire to his knees. 3 days later, Richard Brooks was demonstrably worse, but his arrogance, in a perverse act of compensation, had tripled in volume. The change was stark, terrifyingly so, to the one person in the building trained to see it. During a high-stakes executive board meeting, Kesha, tasked with quietly refreshing the coffee and water, witnessed him confuse the names of his own senior directors, men he had worked with for over a decade. He repeated the same question 3 times in the space of 10 minutes, each time with the same aggressive impatience, oblivious to the confused and worried glances being exchanged across the polished mahogany table. When the meeting finally broke, and Kesha moved in to discreetly clear the table of half-empty cups and scattered papers, she overheard a hushed exchange that sent a chill down her spine. "Richard, are you all right? You seem a little confused." Today, James Morrison, the company's CFO, and one of the few men who dared to speak to Richard with a semblance of familiarity, murmured, his voice laced with genuine concern. "Confused?" Richard exploded, slamming a fist on the table with a force that rattled the crystal water pitcher. "I'm perfectly fine. Maybe it's you who can't keep up with my thinking, James. I've always been 3 steps ahead of everyone in this room. Perhaps you're slipping." Kesha, her back to the men, saw it all reflected in the gleaming surface of the boardroom window. The subtle but undeniable tremor in Richard's left hand as it rested on the table. The way he blinked rapidly, repeatedly, as if trying to force the world into focus. They were progressive neurological symptoms, a classic presentation she had seen countless times during her tenure in the neurology department at Metropolitan Hospital. That was before her career, her life, had been systematically dismantled. The scandal, a 5-year-old wound that still ached with a phantom pain, had begun with a simple act of professional integrity. As head nurse on the night shift, Kesha had noticed a disturbing pattern. Dr. Mitchell Barnes, a charismatic and well-connected surgeon, was prescribing opioids at an alarming rate, but his prescription patterns were selective. She began to document, meticulously, painstakingly. Her research revealed a stark, undeniable disparity. Black patients, presenting with identical conditions and pain scores to their white counterparts, were consistently prescribed lower doses of painkillers. They were also more quickly and casually labeled as drug seekers in their charts. The memory of the disciplinary meeting was as vivid and painful as if it had happened yesterday. She could still see the condescending face of the hospital director, Dr. Patricia Wells, as she sat across the table. "Are you accusing a respected physician, a pillar of this community, of racism, Ms. Washington?" "I am presenting evidence of a clear and consistent racial bias in his prescription practices," Kesha had replied, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. She had placed her 200-page report on the table, a testament to months of tireless research. "The data speaks for itself, but the internal investigation had been a sham, a kangaroo court designed to protect the powerful." Dr. Barnes was not just a respected physician. He was a personal friend of the hospital's CEO and one of its most generous donors. Instead of examining her evidence, they had turned their investigative lens on her. An alternative narrative was swiftly and skillfully constructed. Kesha Washington was emotionally unstable, they whispered. She was projecting her own personal issues with race onto a complex medical practice. The final, devastating blow came in the form of a fabricated accusation. They claimed she had violated medication protocols, a vague and unsubstantiated charge that they could never prove, but which was more than enough to serve as the pretext for her destruction. Within 6 months, she had lost her license, her reputation, and any hope of ever working in the medical field again. The world she had dedicated her life to had turned on her, chewed her up, and spat her out. "People like you always think the world owes you something," Dr. Barnes had sneered on her last day, his smile a cruel, triumphant slash in his handsome face. "Maybe it's time you accept that some places just aren't for you." Now, 5 years later, cleaning the office of the most powerful man in the pharmaceutical industry, the bitter irony was not lost on her. Richard Brooks's company was one of the largest manufacturers of the very opioids that Dr. Barnes had so selectively, so destructively, prescribed. "Are you still here?" Richard's sharp, abrasive voice jolted her back to the present. The other executives had left. He was alone, watching her with a look of profound irritation. "How long does it take to clean a single desk?" "I'm sorry, Mr. Brooks, I was just being thorough." He let out a short, dismissive laugh. "You're a janitor, not a surgeon. In your line of work, speed matters more than perfection, remember that." Kesha nodded silently, her face a mask of neutrality, but her eyes, her sharp diagnostic eyes, continued their work. She noted that Richard's right pupil was now slightly, but noticeably, more dilated than his left. His verbal responses carried a subtle delay, a fractional lag between thought and speech. His fine motor coordination, as he attempted to gather his papers, was clearly impaired. They were classic signs of increased intracranial pressure, a symptom that screamed of a space-occupying lesion in the brain. And another thing, Richard continued, his voice thick with condescension as he struggled with the knot of his silk tie. The next time you get the brilliant idea to offer me medical advice, just remember that I have some of the finest doctors in the country on my payroll. I hardly need the opinion of someone who cleans toilets for a living. The casual cruelty of the words, the deliberate intent to wound, was breathtaking. But Kesha had built a fortress around her heart. A wall constructed brick by brick with every insult, every slight, every act of systematic discrimination she had endured. She absorbed the blow without flinching. I understand perfectly, sir, she replied, her voice a model of deference. She began to pack away her cleaning supplies, her movements calm and deliberate. But as she left the silent, cavernous office, she made a decision. The time for quiet observation was over. The time for action had come. That night, in the cramped but tidy apartment that was all she could afford, Kesha sat down at her laptop. The glow of the screen illuminated her face, her expression a mixture of grim determination and righteous anger. She was no longer a registered nurse. She had no credentials, no license, no authority. A formal medical report was out of the question, so she began something different, something more creative, something more dangerous. She began to write a letter, a detailed, anonymous letter, addressed to Richard's wife, Margaret Brooks. Kesha had done her research. She knew that Margaret was a trained nurse, a graduate of Johns Hopkins. Though she hadn't practiced in years, she would understand the clinical language. She would recognize the gravity of the symptoms described. Kesha wrote with the precision of a seasoned clinician. Each symptom was documented with temporal accuracy. Each observation was backed up by specific, concrete behavioral evidence. She described the anisocoria, the unequal pupil size. She detailed the dysarthria, the slurred speech. She noted the ataxia, the impaired coordination. She painted a picture so clear, so detailed, so medically accurate, that no one with any training could possibly ignore it. She finished the letter at 3 in the morning, the city silent around her. She reread it 5 times, checking every word, every phrase. Then, she printed it, slipped it into a plain, unmarked envelope, and sealed it. Richard Brooks, in his ignorance, thought he had silenced another inferior. He thought he had won another petty battle in his long and successful war against the world. He had no idea that he had just awakened something far more powerful, far more dangerous than simple anger. He had awakened a nurse with a mission to save lives, even when those lives belonged to the very people who despised her. As Kesha held the sealed envelope in her hand, a cold, hard certainty settled in her chest. She would not allow Richard Brooks's arrogance to be his death sentence, not because he deserved to be saved, but because she had taken an oath, and some oaths, she knew, transcended the pettiness, the cruelty, the ignorance of the men you were sworn to save. The letter arrived in Margaret Brooks's manicured hands on a quiet Tuesday morning, delivered not by the usual mail carrier, but by an anonymous courier service. The absence of a return address was the first thing that piqued her curiosity. The clinical precision of the contents was what seized her with a cold, terrifying dread. Progressive neurological symptoms, she murmured, her eyes scanning the neatly TYPED lines for the 3rd time. Impaired motor coordination, episodes of temporal confusion, anisocoria. Each medical term, each meticulously documented observation, was a hammer blow against the wall of denial she had been trying, and failing, to maintain for weeks. The letter articulated the very fears she had tried to voice to her husband, only to be met with the same dismissive contempt he reserved for his subordinates. Margaret knew her husband was not well. The angry, irrational outbursts had become a near-daily occurrence. He forgot important appointments, a cardinal sin for a man who lived by his calendar. He repeated the same stories at dinner parties, his once sharp mind caught in a recursive loop. His handwriting, once a model of calligraphic precision, now trembled with the palsy of a much older, frailer man. Who could have written this? She wondered aloud, the letter trembling in her hand. The depth of the medical knowledge, the specificity of the observations, pointed to a single, inescapable conclusion. Someone with formal medical training, someone who watched her husband closely and regularly, was trying to sound an alarm. Meanwhile, on the 30th floor of the Brooks Pharmaceutical Tower, Kesha Washington was executing the second phase of her plan with the quiet efficiency of a seasoned operative. Her daily cleaning rounds had become a covert intelligence-gathering mission. She documented everything: the times and durations of Richard's episodes of confusion, the increasing intensity of his tremors, the subtle but undeniable patterns of his cognitive decline. In this lonely, dangerous endeavor, she had found an unlikely and invaluable ally. Dr. Patricia Williams was a retired neurologist who now worked part-time as a medical insurance consultant in the building next door. Their first meeting had been a chance encounter in the parking garage. Kesha had been helping an elderly woman who had stumbled and fallen, and Dr. Williams, a sharp-eyed black woman in her early 60s, had observed the interaction.
You were
a nurse, she had said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. Kesha had braced herself for the usual follow-up questions, the judgment, the pity. For 15 years, she had admitted, her voice tight, but Dr. Williams had simply extended a hand. Neurologist 430, she had replied, her handshake firm and her smile genuine. I still recognize competence when I see it. That brief, chance encounter had blossomed into an unlikely partnership. They met for coffee at a corner cafe, two brilliant medical minds relegated to the margins by a system that had no room for them. Dr. Williams, who had fought her own lonely battles against the sexism and racism endemic to the medical profession, listened intently as Kesha described Richard's symptoms. It could be a brain tumor, an aneurysm, or something progressive like multiple sclerosis. Dr. Williams had diagnosed, her mind quickly running through the differential diagnoses. Any one of those conditions could be fatal if left untreated. His arrogance is literally going to kill him. Have you been documenting everything carefully? Kesha had produced her tattered notebook, its pages filled with her meticulous handwritten observations. Patricia had nodded, her expression a mixture of professional approval and grim concern. This man should have been undergoing a full battery of neurological tests weeks ago. We need to find a way to get through to him. Their plan was simple. In theory, provide Margaret Brooks with enough irrefutable evidence to force her husband to seek a complete neurological evaluation, but Richard himself was the primary obstacle. His denial a fortress against their efforts. Dr. Harrison told me I might be working too hard, Richard had commented to Margaret over dinner one evening, blissfully unaware that he had just referred to his dermatologist as if he were his cardiologist. But I don't trust these young doctors. They're always so eager to diagnose problems that don't even exist. Margaret had exchanged a worried glance with their daughter, Jessica, finally a medical student who was home for the weekend. Jessica, too, had noticed the alarming changes in her father. Dad, when was the last time you had a complete checkup? She had asked, her tone gentle, cautious. Checkups are for sick people, Richard had retorted, his voice rising with a familiar defensive irritation. I built a multi-billion-dollar pharmaceutical empire from the ground up. I think I know when there's something wrong with my own body. It was during that same week that the most alarming episode to date occurred. Kesha was in the conference room after hours, organizing the space for the next day's meetings. When Richard walked in, his eyes vacant, his movements unsteady. Where is everyone? He asked, his voice a confused mumble as he looked around the empty room. The meeting was cancelled, Mr. Brooks. You cancelled it yourself yesterday morning, Kesha replied softly. Richard stared at her, his expression blank, unrecognizing. It was as if he was seeing her for the very first time, despite the fact that she had been cleaning his office every single day for the past 2 years. Who are you? He asked, a flicker of fear in his eyes. I'm Kesha, sir, from the cleaning staff. Kesha. He repeated the name several times, as if trying to dredge it up from a deep, muddy recess of his memory. You said something about doctors earlier. For a terrifying, heart-stopping moment, Kesha saw the same lost, vacant look she had seen in the eyes of so many of her former patients on the neurology ward. The person behind those eyes, the brilliant, ruthless, arrogant man who ran this empire, was gradually, inexorably, disconnecting from reality. Mr. Brooks, are you feeling all right? She asked, her training, her instinct, her fundamental humanity overriding the rigid protocols of her current position. The question seemed to jolt him back to the present. The fog in his eyes cleared, replaced by the familiar glint of hostility. I'm fine, he growled, his voice regaining its customary sharpness. And you are not paid to ask me personal questions. Get back to your work. But Kesha had seen enough. That afternoon she made an urgent call to Dr. Williams. Time is running out, she said, her voice tight with a desperate urgency. Today, he didn't recognize me. for several minutes. This isn't just arrogance anymore. This is active, rapid neurological deterioration. Then we need to accelerate the plan, Patricia replied, her own voice grim. I'll call Margaret Brooks directly. As a fellow physician, I can frame it as professional concern. It will carry more weight than an anonymous letter. That night, as Richard slept a heavy, unnatural sleep, another worrying symptom, Margaret had noted she received the call from Dr. Williams. Mrs. Brooks, this is Dr. Patricia Williams, neurologist. I'm calling because I have received some deeply concerning third-hand information about your husband's symptoms. Based on what I've heard, I believe he needs an immediate and thorough neurological evaluation. Margaret gripped the phone, her hand trembling. Doctor, I've been trying to convince him to seek help for weeks, but he refuses to listen. He's not himself. I understand completely, Dr. Williams said, her voice a soothing bum of professional empathy. Unfortunately, it is a common and tragic irony that many neurological conditions rob the patient of the very ability to recognize their own symptoms. It's a condition called anosognosia. It is a direct consequence of the disease process itself. The conversation lasted for 40 minutes. By the time she hung up the phone, Margaret Brooks had a plan. The next day, she would do something she had never once done in 25 years of marriage. She would confront her husband, publicly, in front of the very people whose opinions he valued more than his own life. She arranged an emergency meeting of the board of directors at their sprawling suburban mansion, under the guise of discussing the company's succession plan. In reality, it would be a medical intervention. Kesha, who had been discreetly informed of the plan by Dr. Williams, felt a knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach. She could only hope it would be enough. The family intervention was staged on a stormy Thursday afternoon, a fitting backdrop for the drama that was about to unfold. Richard, at his most vulnerable, his most confused, descended the grand, curving staircase of his mansion, staggering slightly, attempting to mask his compromised coordination with a slow, deliberate gait. His left side was now noticeably weaker than his right. His speech slurred at the edges of his words. I still don't understand the necessity of this meeting, he muttered to Margaret, his trembling fingers fumbling with the knot of his tie. Discussing succession. I'm perfectly capable of running my own company for another 20 years. Of course you are, dear Margaret replied, her voice a smooth, calm veneer over a churning sea of fear. This is just preventive planning for the future. In the boardroom, the tension was palpable. The directors, the 5 most powerful executives at Brooks Pharmaceutical, immediately noticed the dramatic change in their leader. James Morrison, the CFO, exchanged a series of increasingly alarmed glances with Sandra Phillips, the head of operations, when Richard repeatedly referred to his marketing director as that fellow from the sales department. Dr. Williams, whom Margaret had invited to attend as a medical consultant for executive health, made her move. Richard, she interjected, her voice calm but authoritative. I've observed some troubling symptoms during our recent interactions. The tremors, the temporal confusion, the impaired coordination. There is nothing wrong with me, Richard exploded, slamming his fist on the table with a force that sent a coffee cup skittering across the polished surface. I am sick and tired of unqualified people trying to diagnose me. And then, it happened. In a desperate attempt to prove his vitality, his strength, his undiminished power, Richard tried to push himself up from his chair, but his legs, no longer under the command of his brain, gave out completely. He collapsed back into his seat, a puppet with its strings cut. The left side of his face began to twitch, a grotesque, involuntary spasm. His eyes lost their focus, rolling back in his head as he struggled, and failed, to form a coherent word. I don't, where, he slurred, his right hand shaking violently as he tried, and failed, to reach for a glass of water. Margaret, her face a mask of grim resolve, was already dialing 911. Dr. Williams rushed to his side, taking control of the chaotic scene. Acute neurological event, she announced, her voice cutting through the panicked gasps of the directors. Possible stroke or a secondary seizure related to an intracranial mass. We need immediate transport to the hospital. As the distant wail of an ambulance grew closer, something unexpected happened. Margaret's phone rang. The caller ID was blocked. She almost ignored it, but some instinct made her answer. Mrs. Brooks, this is Kesha, from your husband's office. The cleaning staff. The voice was quiet, urgent. I'm calling because I need you to know. I've documented all of his symptoms. For the past several weeks, it's all in a report. Margaret nearly dropped the phone. You're a nurse. I was, Kesha replied, a universe of pain and bitterness in those 2 words. Before I was forced to clean offices for a living by people who treat me like I'm invisible. Her voice was laced with a righteous anger, but underneath, it was the unmistakable bedrock of medical competence. Your husband has the classic signs of a brain tumor or a slow bleeding aneurysm, the progressive symptoms, the cognitive decline, the unilateral tremors. It's all there. What report? Margaret whispered, her mind reeling. The one I sent to every single one of his board members 3 days ago. The 47-page report detailing my medical observations, complete with timestamps and a symptom analysis. The same report that they all ignored, because it came from a mere cleaning lady. The revelation hit Margaret with the force of a physical blow. James Morrison had dismissed it as employee paranoia. Sandra Phillips had suggested that Kesha be terminated for inappropriate and obsessive behavior. As her husband was carefully loaded into the back of the ambulance, his life hanging by a thread, Margaret was struck by the full, terrible, world-shattering irony of the situation. The woman her husband had treated with the most profound, most casual contempt, was the only person who had tried to save his life. At the hospital, the emergency CT scan confirmed every one of Kesha's suspicions. A slow-bleeding brain aneurysm, located in a critical area of his frontal lobe, was causing the progressive neurological symptoms. If it weren't for this intervention today, the emergency room doctor told a shaken Margaret, he would have suffered a complete, catastrophic rupture within days. His chances of survival would have been close to zero. When Richard regained consciousness hours later, after a long and delicate emergency surgery, his first words were a hoarse, desperate whisper, where is the cleaning lady? Margaret, her eyes, red-rimmed from hours of weeping, held his hand. She's in the hallway, dear. She's been waiting for 6 hours. She tried to warn me, he whispered, tears streaming down his pale, drawn cheeks, and I treated her like trash. I need to talk to her. When Kesha entered the sterile, quiet room of the ICU, Richard could barely meet her gaze. The woman he had publicly, repeatedly humiliated stood before him, still in her simple cleaning uniform, but she carried herself with a quiet dignity that made his own past arrogance seem pathetic. Small and profoundly ugly. You saved my life, he whispered, his voice cracking. I've been trying to save it for weeks, she replied, her voice devoid of triumph, of malice, of anything other than a simple, unadorned truth. You chose to humiliate me instead. I know, his voice broke. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. You're right, Kesha said, her honesty as sharp and clean as a sterile blade. You don't. She pulled up a chair and sat, keeping a respectful distance. But I didn't save your life for you, Mr. Brooks. I saved it because I took an oath, a long time ago, to protect and preserve life. And some oaths are bigger and more important than the treatment we receive from the people we save. Richard's humiliation, however, was just beginning. In the days that followed, as he began the long, painful road to recovery, the full story leaked out. The billionaire CEO who nearly died because he was too arrogant, too prejudiced, to listen, to the black cleaning lady who had correctly diagnosed his condition weeks earlier, the board of directors who had ignored her detailed, 47-page medical report, dismissing it as the ravings of an unstable, unimportant woman. The story became a national sensation, a viral symbol of corporate hubris and systemic discrimination. The headline, "Black Cleaner Saves CEO Who Despised Her," was splashed across every news outlet in the country. But the Brooks Pharmaceutical Board was forced into an emergency meeting. The company's stock plummeted, losing over $300 million in market value in just 3 days. Richard was forced to step down as CEO to recover and to reflect on the company's human resources policies. But the greatest, most profound humiliation came when Richard learned that Kesha had refused all offers of financial compensation or requests for paid interviews. I don't need anyone's blood money, she told a crowd of reporters gathered outside the hospital. I need this to serve as an example. Competence and dignity and basic human decency do not depend on a person's job title or their bank account or the color of their skin. While Richard began the arduous process of physical therapy, of learning to walk and talk again, of confronting the wreckage of his life and his reputation, Kesha quietly returned to her job. But now, when she walked the halls of the Brooks Pharmaceutical Tower, the employees, from the mailroom clerk to the senior vice presidents, parted before her, their eyes filled with a new, profound respect. The man who had spent a lifetime looking down on the people he considered inferior had learned, in the most public and humiliating way possible, that his very existence depended on the grace and competence of the woman he had deemed invisible. And the entire world was watching as he learned his lesson, a lesson served up on the national news, a story of arrogance, ignorance, and the quiet, unassailable power of the truth.